Democritus begins his philosophy with a deceptively simple question. What is the world actually made of? We see trees, stones, animals, people, clouds, rivers, and stars. Everything seems to have its own shape and character. Things appear to come into existence, change, break apart, and disappear. Yet Democritus asks whether this visible world tells us what reality is really like underneath. His answer is one of the boldest ideas of ancient philosophy. Everything that exists is made from tiny, indivisible bodies moving through empty space. He called these bodies atoms. The word atom comes from a Greek word meaning something that cannot be cut. Democritus imagined reality as being composed of extremely small pieces of matter that could not themselves be divided into smaller parts. These atoms were not alive, conscious, or purposeful. They were physical bodies with different shapes and arrangements, moving through space. The world we experience would then be the result of their combinations. A tree is not fundamentally a tree in the deepest sense. It is an arrangement of atoms. A stone is another arrangement. Water is another. An animal is another. Even the human body is composed of these tiny bodies. This idea completely changes the way we look at ordinary things. When a piece of wood burns, Democritus does not need to imagine that the wood has simply vanished. The arrangement has changed. The atoms that once formed the wood have been separated and rearranged. What appears to us as destruction is, at a deeper level, a change in arrangement. The same reasoning can be applied to growth. A young tree becomes large because matter is added and reorganized. A human body develops because material enters the body through food and is transformed. Nothing needs to appear from absolute nothingness. Democritus is therefore trying to explain change without giving up the idea that something remains. If everything could simply appear from nothing and disappear into nothing, then the world would be extremely difficult to understand. But if there are permanent building blocks moving and combining in different ways, then constant change becomes easier to explain. The atoms remain while their arrangements change. This is where empty space becomes essential. If atoms are always present and cannot disappear, how can they move? Democritus answers that there must be void, empty space in which movement is possible. This was a radical idea because many earlier philosophers had struggled with the very possibility of empty space. Democritus believed that without the void, movement could not be explained. Atoms need somewhere to move, separate, collide, and combine. Reality therefore consists of two fundamental things, atoms and void. The atoms provide what exists physically. The void provides the space in which they can move. From these two principles, Democritus attempts to explain the enormous variety of the world. Atoms can differ in shape, size, arrangement, and position. Some may be smooth. Others may be rough or irregular. Some arrangements can form stable structures, while others can quickly break apart. This means that the qualities we experience in everyday life are not necessarily properties that exist in exactly the same way at the smallest level. A sweet fruit tastes sweet to us. A stone feels hard. A flower has a particular smell. A surface appears warm or cold. But Democritus believes that these experiences arise from interactions between external objects and our senses. The object exists physically, but the experience of the object is produced within the perceiver. This distinction leads to one of the most important parts of his philosophy, the difference between what reality is and how reality appears to us. Our senses give us access to the world, but they do not necessarily reveal its deepest structure. We see colors, we hear sounds, we taste flavors, we smell scents, we feel textures. Yet Democritus believes that beneath all these qualities, there is a simpler physical reality involving atoms and their movements. This does not mean that sensory experience is useless. Without the senses, we would have no ordinary knowledge of the world. But the senses can only show us appearances. Reason must go further and ask what produces those appearances. Imagine looking at honey. It appears golden, smooth, and sweet. Those qualities are part of our experience. But Democritus wants to ask what happens at the level of matter. What physical structure allows the honey to produce the sensation of sweetness? What arrangement of tiny bodies interacts with the body of the observer? The question moves from appearance to explanation. This is one of the reasons Democritus is so important in the history of natural philosophy. He does not simply ask what things look like. He asks what physical processes could produce what we observe. The universe, in this picture, does not require every event to have been arranged specifically for human beings. Atoms move according to their physical nature. They collide. They separate. They form temporary structures. Some structures survive for long periods. Others disappear quickly. The world becomes a vast process of formation and dissolution. This also changes the way Democritus thinks about life. Living things are not separated from the physical world by some completely different kind of substance. Human beings, animals, and plants are all physical arrangements of matter. Life is a particular organization of material processes. Even the soul, in his philosophy, is connected to physical matter. He associates the soul with very fine, active atoms that move rapidly. These particles are spread through the body and are responsible for life and sensation. This means that the human being is not imagined as a mysterious soul temporarily attached to a body. The living person is a physical system. That idea has enormous consequences. If the mind depends upon physical processes, then changes in the body can affect thought, perception, memory, and emotion. Sleep, injury, illness, exhaustion, and other bodily conditions can change the way a person experiences the world. For Democritus, there is no need to create an absolute division between the mental and the physical. The human being belongs to nature. And because the human being belongs to nature, understanding ourselves requires understanding the natural world. This leads Democritus toward a broader lesson about knowledge. Human beings often believe that what appears obvious must be true. The sun appears small because it is far away. A straight object can look bent when partly placed in water. A distant object appears tiny even though its actual size may be enormous. Our senses provide appearances, but appearances can mislead. Reason allows us to investigate. This does not mean that reason should simply reject the senses. Democritus needs observation in order to begin thinking about nature. Instead, the senses provide evidence while reason examines what that evidence means. There is a humility here that remains valuable. We should not assume that the first appearance of something is the final truth about it. The world is more complicated than it looks, and the same may be true of ourselves. We often think of ourselves as fixed individuals with permanent identities. But if the body is an arrangement of matter that is constantly changing, then the person we call ourselves is also involved in continuous physical change. Cells are replaced. Bodies grow older. Memories change. Habits develop. Emotions rise and disappear. The person who exists today is connected to the person who existed years ago, but is not physically identical in every respect. Democritus gives us a picture of existence in which stability and change exist together. The basic matter remains, while arrangements come and go. This also gives his philosophy a particular attitude toward death. If the soul is physical, then death is not the journey of an eternal individual substance into another realm. It is the dissolution of the physical organization that made a living person possible. The atoms continue. The particular arrangement ends. For Democritus, this removes much of the mystery surrounding death. The body returns to the larger physical world from which it came. This can sound cold, but his philosophy is not simply an exercise in reducing everything to matter. He also develops an ethical vision concerned with how a human being should live. The person who understands nature should not spend their entire life chasing things that create anxiety. Wealth can be useful, but endless desire creates restlessness. Fame can be pleasant, but dependence upon other people's admiration makes a person vulnerable. Pleasure has value, but uncontrolled pleasure can damage the very life it was supposed to improve. Democritus therefore places great importance on inner balance. He is often associated with the idea of cheerfulness or good spirits, sometimes described through the Greek concept of euthymia. This does not mean constant laughter or shallow happiness. It refers to a stable and well-ordered condition of the mind. A person with a balanced mind does not need to possess everything in order to feel content. They can enjoy what they have without constantly measuring it against what someone else possesses. They can pursue reasonable goals without becoming consumed by them. They can accept limitations without turning every limitation into a source of misery. This ethical side of Democritus' thought is closely connected to his natural philosophy. If everything is part of a changing physical order, then human happiness should not depend upon controlling the entire world. We have limited power. We should therefore develop a reasonable relationship with our desires. A person who wants too much becomes dependent upon circumstances. The more conditions they believe necessary for happiness, the more fragile their happiness becomes. Someone who believes they must be admired by everyone will suffer whenever they are criticized. Someone who believes they must become extremely wealthy will feel poor even while possessing enough. Someone who believes every desire must be satisfied will experience frustration whenever reality says no. Democritus encourages a different kind of life, one in which reason determines which desires are worth pursuing. This does not require rejecting pleasure. It requires understanding proportion. A good meal can be enjoyed without becoming gluttony. Comfort can be appreciated without becoming dependence. Friendship can be valued without becoming possessiveness. Knowledge can be pursued without turning intellectual pride into arrogance. The aim is not to remove pleasure from life. It is to prevent pleasure from becoming the master of life. For Democritus, wisdom has a practical purpose. It helps a person distinguish between what is genuinely worth pursuing and what merely appears attractive for a moment. And this is where his philosophy moves beyond atoms. He begins with the structure of matter, but eventually reaches a question that concerns every human being. How should I live within this immense physical universe? The answer begins with understanding. We are temporary arrangements of matter. The world is constantly changing. Our senses show us appearances rather than the whole structure of reality. Our desires can easily become excessive, and happiness depends less upon possessing everything we want than upon learning what is worth wanting. Democritus therefore asks us to look beyond the surface of things. The world may appear chaotic, but beneath its changing appearances there may be a simpler physical structure. Life may appear permanent while everything within it is changing. Pleasure may appear to promise happiness while excessive desire quietly creates anxiety. And the individual may appear separate from nature while actually being completely woven into it. To understand these things is to begin seeing the world differently, not as a collection of objects arranged for our convenience, but as a vast movement of matter, constantly forming, changing, separating, and coming together. And within that enormous movement, for a short period of time, we are here, capable of observing it, questioning it, and trying to live wisely within it. Democritus takes his picture of nature and pushes it toward a deeper question. If everything is made of atoms moving through empty space, what does that tell us about human life? For him, the answer begins with a simple fact. Human beings are not outside nature. We are made from the same physical reality as everything around us. The body, the senses, the brain, and the soul belong to the natural world. This means that understanding ourselves requires us to stop treating human life as something completely separate from the rest of existence. The human being is a temporary arrangement that does not make human life worthless. It makes the way we use that life more important. Democritus believes that people often make themselves unhappy by pursuing things without asking what those things will actually do to them. We chase money because we imagine that more money will remove insecurity. We seek reputation because we believe admiration will make us feel important. We compete for status because we think being above others will finally make us satisfied. But desire has a strange quality. Once one desire is satisfied, another often takes its place. A person who has little wants more. A person who has more begins worrying about keeping it. A person who becomes successful may begin worrying about becoming even more successful. The finish line keeps moving. Democritus therefore sees moderation as one of the foundations of a good life. The aim is not to possess as much as possible. It is to live in a way that produces a stable and reasonable state of mind. This is where his idea of happiness becomes important. Happiness is not simply a matter of having pleasant experiences. A person can experience enormous pleasure and still live badly. Someone may constantly seek entertainment, food, luxury, or excitement while becoming increasingly restless inside. Pleasure without judgment can become another form of dependence. Democritus instead values a settled mind. A person should be able to enjoy good things without becoming desperate for them. They should be able to experience difficulty without allowing difficulty to destroy their entire outlook. This balance does not come from luck. It comes from understanding. If you know that wealth can disappear, you will be less shocked when circumstances change. If you know that reputation depends upon other people's opinions, you will be less disturbed when someone criticizes you. If you understand that the body is temporary, you will not be surprised by aging. If you recognize that desires can multiply without limit, you will become more careful about which desires you allow to govern your life. Knowledge changes the way we experience the world. This is one of the strongest connections between Democritus' natural philosophy and his ethics. The same mind that investigates the structure of matter must also investigate the structure of desire. We should examine the world, but we should also examine ourselves. Why do I want this? What do I expect it to give me? Will obtaining it actually improve my life? What might I sacrifice in order to get it? And if I get it, will I finally be satisfied? These questions can interrupt the automatic movement of desire. Democritus does not think every desire deserves obedience. Some desires are reasonable because they contribute to health, friendship, security, or knowledge. Others are excessive because they create endless competition and anxiety. The wise person learns to tell the difference. This also affects his understanding of wealth. He does not simply praise poverty or condemn possessions. Wealth can provide useful things. It can protect people from certain difficulties and give them opportunities. But wealth becomes dangerous when the desire for it becomes unlimited. A person can spend their entire life accumulating more while never learning how much is enough. At that point, wealth has stopped serving the person. The person has begun serving wealth. Democritus wants to reverse that relationship. Possessions should remain tools. They should not become the measure of a life. The same principle applies to status. Human beings naturally compare themselves with others. Someone else receives recognition, and we feel diminished. Someone else becomes wealthy, and we feel poor. Someone else appears more attractive, successful, or respected, and we begin judging our own lives against theirs. Democritus sees this comparison as a source of unnecessary disturbance. There will always be someone with more of something, more money, more influence, more beauty, more recognition, more possessions. If happiness depends upon being ahead of everyone else, happiness becomes almost impossible. A stable life requires a different standard. Instead of asking whether we possess more than another person, we can ask whether our own life is becoming more reasonable, more disciplined, more knowledgeable, and more peaceful. This does not mean abandoning ambition. Democritus respects intellectual and practical achievement, but ambition should remain under the direction of reason. A person can strive for excellence without making superiority over others the purpose of their life. Knowledge is especially valuable because it changes the scale of our concerns. The more we understand nature, the less likely we are to interpret every event as something personally arranged against us. A storm is not an insult. An illness is not necessarily a punishment. A failed plan is not proof that the universe has rejected us. The natural world operates through causes that existed long before our individual concerns. This understanding can reduce superstition. Ancient people often searched for personal intentions behind natural events. A drought might be interpreted as divine anger. A disease might be seen as a punishment. An eclipse might be treated as an omen. Democritus offers a different approach. Look for causes. Ask how something happens. Do not stop at the story that feels emotionally satisfying. The world deserves explanation, not merely interpretation based on fear. This commitment to natural explanation is one of the most important features of his thought. He wants human beings to replace unnecessary fear with understanding. Ignorance can make ordinary events frightening. Knowledge can make them intelligible. If lightning is understood as a natural phenomenon, there is less reason to imagine that every storm is a message directed personally at us. If illness is understood through physical causes, there is less reason to treat suffering as evidence of moral failure. Understanding does not eliminate every difficulty, but it can remove an additional layer of fear created by misunderstanding. Democritus therefore values intellectual independence. A person should not accept a belief simply because everyone around them accepts it. Tradition deserves examination. Popular opinion deserves examination. Even our own assumptions deserve examination. This does not mean rejecting everything that came before us. It means refusing to confuse familiarity with truth. A belief can be ancient and still be wrong. A belief can be unpopular and still be correct. What matters is whether it survives rational examination. This attitude extends to knowledge itself. Democritus recognizes that human understanding has limits. The senses reveal appearances, but they do not give us a complete picture of reality. Reason must investigate what lies beneath them, yet reason also begins with what the senses provide. We see a world of change. We observe things being formed and destroyed. We notice that bodies occupy space and move. From these observations, the mind develops deeper explanations. The senses and reason therefore have different roles. Sensory experience gives us contact with the world. Reason tries to understand the underlying structure. This distinction becomes important because appearances can be persuasive without being accurate. A stick partly submerged in water appears bent. A distant object appears smaller than it really is. The sky seems to move around us while the earth appears stationary. What seems obvious from immediate experience may not be the final truth. Democritus, therefore, encourages intellectual patience. Do not rush from appearance to certainty. Look again. Question the assumption. Consider alternative explanations. Ask what must be true for the appearance to occur. This habit of thought is useful far beyond natural philosophy. It can also be applied to human behavior. Someone speaks harshly, and we immediately decide they hate us. Someone succeeds, and we assume their life must be perfect. Someone fails, and we assume they are incapable. Someone disagrees with us, and we assume they are ignorant. In each case, the first impression may be incomplete. The world is more complicated than our first interpretation of it. Democritus' philosophy, therefore, trains a certain intellectual humility. We should be willing to admit that we do not yet understand something. That admission is not weakness. It is the beginning of inquiry. A person who believes they already understand everything has little reason to learn. A person who recognizes the limits of their knowledge remains curious. This curiosity is one of the most valuable human capacities in Democritus' thought. He is associated with a life devoted to observation, travel, investigation, and learning. The exact details of his life are surrounded by later stories, but the philosophical image is clear. Knowledge requires looking beyond the narrow boundaries of ordinary experience. The world is vast. A person who never questions their immediate surroundings can easily mistake their small corner of existence for the whole. Learning expands perspective. It reveals that customs differ between societies, that beliefs change across generations, and that what seems natural to one person may seem strange to another. This does not mean that all beliefs are equally true. It means that familiarity should not be confused with universality. A mature mind learns to distinguish between what is simply customary and what has a rational foundation. This is especially important in ethics. Many people pursue what society tells them to pursue without asking whether those things actually produce a good life. They seek status because status is admired. They seek wealth because wealth is praised. They seek revenge because revenge is socially encouraged. They fear certain things because everyone around them fears them. Democritus asks us to step back. What actually makes a human life good? His answer is not found in external appearance. It is found in the condition of the mind. A person who possesses little but lives with intelligence, friendship, moderation, and peace may be happier than someone surrounded by luxury and consumed by fear. The important question is therefore not simply what a person has. It is what kind of person those possessions have helped them become, and that returns us to the physical world with which Democritus began. Everything changes. Everything combines and separates. Forms appear and disappear. Human beings are temporary arrangements within this enormous process. We cannot stop that process, but we can understand something about it. And once we understand that we are temporary participants rather than permanent owners of the world, our relationship with life can become less possessive. We can appreciate what exists while it exists. We can pursue knowledge without imagining that we will know everything. We can enjoy pleasure without becoming its servant. We can possess things without allowing possessions to possess us. And we can face change with a little more calm because we understand that change is not an accident added to existence. Change is part of existence itself. Democritus now takes us deeper into the consequences of his view of nature. If everything we encounter is part of a world governed by physical processes, then human beings must reconsider some of the assumptions they normally make about themselves. We are accustomed to thinking that our lives occupy the center of reality. Our problems feel enormous because we experience them from the inside. But from the perspective of nature, each individual life is one small event within something vastly larger. This does not make human concerns meaningless. It places them in proportion. A person can become consumed by a small insult, a temporary embarrassment, or the loss of something they believe they needed. For a while, that event can seem to occupy the whole mind. Democritus encourages a wider view. The world does not stop because one person has been disappointed. Nature continues its movement. The atoms continue moving. Other lives continue unfolding. Time continues. Seeing this does not require us to become cold. It allows us to recognize that not every disturbance deserves to become a permanent burden. This idea connects directly with his understanding of tranquility. A peaceful mind is not a mind that has eliminated every difficulty. It is a mind that has learned not to magnify every difficulty beyond its actual importance. Much of human unhappiness comes from excess. We want more than we need. We fear losing what we have. We compare ourselves with people who have something different. We imagine future disasters before they happen. We revisit past events that cannot be changed. We become attached to opinions about how life should look. Democritus believes that wisdom can interrupt this cycle by bringing desire back to a reasonable scale. The person who knows what is enough has already gained a form of wealth. This does not mean that everyone should live without ambition. It means that ambition should have a boundary. There should be a point at which a person can say, "This is sufficient for a good life." Without such a boundary, desire can become endless. One achievement produces the desire for another. One possession creates the desire for something better. One success creates anxiety about maintaining it. The person keeps moving but never arrives. Democritus sees this as a failure to understand the difference between improvement and endless accumulation. Improving one's life can be sensible. Believing that happiness always lies in the next acquisition can become exhausting. The same problem appears in the pursuit of reputation. Human beings want to be seen as intelligent, successful, attractive, powerful, or admirable. But reputation is unstable because it exists in other people's minds. One person praises us while another criticizes us. The crowd changes its opinion. Circumstances change. Yesterday's admired figure becomes tomorrow's forgotten name. If our inner stability depends upon public approval, then we have given other people control over our peace. Democritus therefore places greater value on what happens inside the person than on how that person appears from the outside. The wise person should ask whether they are becoming better rather than whether they are being admired for appearing better. That difference is subtle but important. Someone may perform generosity because they want praise. Another person may quietly help someone without expecting recognition. From the outside, both actions may look similar, but their inner motivations are different. Democritus' philosophy is concerned with this inner condition. A good life is not merely a collection of socially approved actions. It requires a mind that understands why those actions are worthwhile. This is also why he values knowledge so highly. Ignorance does not simply mean lacking information. It can distort the way a person lives. Someone who misunderstands what is valuable may spend their entire life pursuing things that cannot provide lasting satisfaction. Someone who believes wealth is the highest good may sacrifice friendship for money. Someone who believes reputation is everything may sacrifice honesty to maintain an image. Someone who believes pleasure is the purpose of existence may damage their health and relationships in pursuit of immediate satisfaction. Knowledge can reveal these mistakes. It can show that some pleasures have consequences. It can show that some achievements are less valuable than they appear. It can show that some fears are based on misunderstanding. And it can show that a quieter life may contain more genuine happiness than a life filled with constant competition. Democritus' natural philosophy also gives him a way to challenge fear of the supernatural. If natural events have natural causes, then people do not need to invent hidden intentions behind every unusual occurrence. A storm does not have to be a personal warning. An earthquake does not have to be a message directed at one community. A disease does not have to mean that someone has been morally condemned. This does not mean that Democritus can explain every natural event by modern standards. His scientific picture of the world was limited by the knowledge available in his time. But his method is important. He looks for physical explanations rather than immediately turning to supernatural stories. That habit represents a major shift in intellectual history. Instead of asking only what an event means symbolically, ask what causes it. Instead of assuming that nature behaves according to human emotions, investigate how nature actually behaves. Instead of allowing fear to fill gaps in knowledge, use inquiry to reduce those gaps. The same intellectual discipline can be applied to the mind. When we feel afraid, we can ask what exactly we are afraid of. When we feel angry, we can ask what judgment produced the anger. When we desire something intensely, we can ask whether the object is genuinely valuable or whether we have simply become accustomed to wanting it. This kind of self-examination prevents emotions from becoming unquestioned authorities. Democritus does not ask human beings to become machines without feeling. He recognizes that pleasure and pain are part of embodied life. What matters is whether reason remains capable of guiding them. A person can enjoy pleasure without becoming dependent upon it. They can experience pain without concluding that existence has become meaningless. They can experience fear without allowing fear to determine every decision. They can experience anger without turning anger into a permanent identity. The balanced mind remains capable of responding rather than simply reacting. This balance also matters in friendship. Democritus considers friendship one of the genuine sources of happiness. Human beings cannot live well in complete isolation. We need companionship, trust, conversation, affection, and mutual assistance. But friendship should not become another form of possession. A healthy friendship allows both people to remain free. It is built upon goodwill rather than constant calculation. We do not ask only what another person can provide us. We value them as people. This also means that friendship requires character. Trust cannot survive endless dishonesty. Affection cannot survive constant exploitation. Respect cannot survive contempt. A good friend is not merely someone who provides pleasant company. A good friend contributes to the stability and goodness of another person's life. Democritus' emphasis on moderation therefore extends into relationships. Excessive dependence can create fear. Possessiveness can turn affection into control. Suspicion can destroy trust. A reasonable relationship allows closeness without demanding ownership. This principle can be extended to almost everything we value. Enjoy things without becoming enslaved by them. Love people without imagining that you own them. Pursue success without believing that success defines your worth. Seek knowledge without believing that you already understand everything. Protect yourself without becoming consumed by fear. These are forms of moderation. Moderation does not mean living without intensity. It means allowing reason to determine where intensity is useful and where it becomes destructive. Democritus also recognizes that human beings are shaped by their surroundings. The people we spend time with influence our habits, expectations, and attitudes. A person surrounded by constant greed may gradually begin to see greed as normal. Someone surrounded by cruelty may become less sensitive to suffering. This makes the choice of company important. We should spend time with people who strengthen good qualities rather than constantly feeding our worst impulses. The same applies to education. Education is not simply the accumulation of facts. It is the development of judgment. A person can know many things and still make terrible decisions if they do not understand how to use knowledge wisely. The educated person should therefore become more capable of distinguishing appearance from reality, necessity from excess, and genuine value from empty status. This is why Democritus' philosophy remains connected to everyday life despite beginning with extremely abstract questions about matter. The structure of the universe may seem far removed from the problem of how to live tomorrow morning, but for him, the two are connected. If we understand that everything belongs to nature, we become less likely to imagine ourselves as separate from it. If we understand that everything changes, we become less shocked by change. If we understand that our senses provide only appearances, we become more careful about first impressions. If we understand that excessive desire creates instability, we become more selective about what we pursue. If we understand that our lives are temporary, we may become more careful about how we spend them. This produces a philosophy that is simultaneously physical and ethical. The universe is made of atoms and void. Human beings are part of that universe. Our experiences arise from physical processes. Our minds can investigate those processes, and that understanding can change the way we live. Democritus does not ask us to escape the material world. He asks us to understand it, and through understanding the world, we may become better at understanding ourselves. We begin to see that many things we fear are temporary. Many things we desire are insufficient to satisfy us. Many things we consider essential are actually optional, and many things we overlook, especially knowledge, friendship, moderation, and peace of mind, may be far more valuable than we originally understood. The person who learns this does not need to withdraw from ordinary life. They can continue working, eating, speaking, traveling, learning, loving, and enjoying the world. But they do so with a different center. They're no longer constantly asking, "What can I obtain?" They begin asking, "What kind of life is worth living?" And that question leads Democritus toward the deepest part of his philosophy. The idea that happiness is not something we discover at the end of endless acquisition. It is something we cultivate by learning what is enough. Democritus brings his philosophy to its deepest point by returning to the condition of the human mind. We live inside a universe that is enormous, changing, and indifferent to our private wishes. We cannot command it, and we cannot fully understand it. Yet within this vast reality, we have a limited period in which we can learn, think, form friendships, and decide how to live. For Democritus, wisdom begins when we stop wasting that limited life on endless dissatisfaction. A person who always wants more can never feel that they have enough. More wealth creates the fear of losing it. More status creates the need for greater recognition. More pleasure creates the desire for stronger pleasure. The mind becomes restless because it has never learned where to stop. Moderation offers another possibility. We can enjoy what is good without demanding that it become unlimited. We can appreciate comfort without believing that discomfort makes life worthless. We can value possessions without allowing them to determine our identity. We can seek success without becoming dependent upon being admired. The aim is a settled mind. This is what makes Democritus' idea of happiness deeper than simple pleasure. Pleasure comes and goes. Tranquility depends more upon how a person orders their desires. Someone with modest possessions and a peaceful mind may live better than someone surrounded by luxury, but constantly afraid of losing it. The question is not simply how much we possess. It is how much possession controls us. The same principle applies to knowledge. Democritus believes that human beings should look beyond appearances. Our senses are useful, but they do not reveal everything. What appears obvious may turn out to be misleading, and what seems mysterious may have a natural explanation. This creates a habit of intellectual humility. We should investigate before assuming. We should question before declaring certainty. We should be willing to change our minds when better understanding becomes available. For Democritus, ignorance becomes dangerous when it produces fear. When people do not understand nature, they may fill the unknown with superstition. When they understand causes, some of that fear disappears. The universe does not need to be interpreted as a series of personal messages. Nature operates according to its own processes. This also changes the way we think about death. The human body is part of nature, and the soul, in Democritus' materialist account, is also connected to physical matter. When the organization that makes a living person possible breaks apart, the individual life ends. The atoms continue, but the particular person does not. This view can sound severe, yet it can also encourage a more direct appreciation of life. We do not need to imagine ourselves as permanent owners of existence. We are temporary participants. That should make the present more valuable, not less. Friendship becomes important for the same reason. Human beings need one another, and genuine friendship can bring a kind of happiness that possessions cannot provide. A trusted friend is not merely useful. Friendship gives life companionship, understanding, and shared experience. But good relationships require moderation too. Affection should not become possession. Trust should not become constant suspicion. Another person should be valued as a person, not merely as something that satisfies our needs. Democritus' ethics therefore comes together around a few central qualities: reason, moderation, knowledge, friendship, and inner balance. He wants us to understand the world without unnecessary fear, desire without endless excess, and our own lives without exaggerated importance. We are made of the same physical reality as everything else. We are temporary, we are limited, but we are also capable of understanding. That ability gives us a responsibility to use our brief existence wisely. We cannot stop the atoms from moving. We cannot stop time. We cannot prevent every loss. We cannot make every desire come true. But we can decide whether we will spend our lives chasing things that never satisfy us, or whether we will learn what is genuinely enough. That is perhaps the quiet strength of Democritus' philosophy. He begins with the smallest imagined pieces of matter and ends with a question about the quality of a human life. What is the universe made of? Atoms and void. What is a human being? A temporary arrangement within that universe. What should such a person do with their limited existence? Understand nature, control excessive desire, value friendship, seek knowledge, and cultivate a peaceful mind. The world will continue changing long after our individual lives have ended. We do not need to defeat that fact. We only need to understand it well enough to live wisely while we are here. Democritus began his philosophy with a question that sounds almost impossible to answer. What is the world actually made of? Not what does the world look like? Not what do human beings believe about it? But what exists underneath everything we can see? A tree can be cut down and reduced to pieces of wood. The wood can be burned and become ash. The ash can be scattered and disappear from sight. A body grows from infancy into old age and eventually becomes part of the earth. Water evaporates, clouds form, rain falls, rivers move toward the sea, and the same material seems to appear in different forms again and again. The visible world is constantly changing. Yet Democritus suspected that beneath this endless change there must be something that does not disappear simply because our senses can no longer see it. Something fundamental, something indivisible, something from which everything else is constructed. This became the foundation of one of the most extraordinary philosophical ideas of the ancient world. Atoms. Long before microscopes, chemistry, molecular biology, or modern physics, Democritus imagined that reality was composed of unimaginably small particles moving through empty space. But the importance of his philosophy goes far beyond the fact that he happened to anticipate one aspect of modern science. His deeper achievement was methodological. He wanted human beings to stop assuming that the world must be exactly as it appears to the senses. The senses show us colors. They show us sounds. They show us tastes. They show us textures. But perhaps these qualities are not the deepest properties of reality. Perhaps what we experience is the result of something happening beneath perception. A world made of invisible structures could produce visible appearances. That possibility would become one of the most important ideas in the history of natural philosophy. Democritus was born around the 5th century BCE, probably in Abdera, a Greek city in Thrace. He came from a wealthy family, and according to ancient accounts, he used much of his inheritance to travel widely in search of knowledge. The stories surrounding his journeys are difficult to verify in every detail, but the image they preserve is revealing. Democritus was intensely curious. He wanted to see what existed beyond his immediate environment. He is associated with travels through regions of the ancient world, including Egypt and Persia, and perhaps other places as well. Whether every journey attributed to him actually occurred is uncertain, but his philosophical reputation clearly became connected with an extraordinary breadth of learning. He was interested in nature, mathematics, astronomy, biology, ethics, language, perception, and human society. He did not see knowledge as a collection of isolated subjects. Reality was one thing. If the world had an underlying structure, then everything from the movement of stars to the growth of plants and the behavior of human beings could potentially be understood through the same natural principles. This was a radical ambition. The ancient world contained many competing explanations of reality. Some philosophers believed that change itself was impossible in any ultimate sense. Others believed that everything was constantly changing. Some explained the cosmos through divine powers. Others searched for fundamental substances such as water, air, fire, or earth. Democritus inherited these debates and pushed them in a different direction. He asked whether change could be explained without requiring matter itself to come into existence from nothing or disappear completely. Suppose you have a piece of wood. You break it in half. Then you break one piece again, and again, and again. You can continue imagining the process. But can you continue forever? Democritus believed there must eventually be a limit. There must be particles so small that they cannot be divided any further. He called them atoms, from a Greek word meaning indivisible. These atoms were not miniature versions of the objects we see around us. They were more fundamental than that. They had different shapes and arrangements. They moved. They collided. They combined. They separated. And through their different configurations, they produce the enormous variety of things we experience. The world, therefore, did not need a separate substance for every object. A stone, a tree, a human body, a cloud, and a mountain could all arise from different arrangements of the same fundamental material. This was a profound simplification. Instead of asking why every individual thing exists as a completely unique kind of substance, Democritus could ask a more general question. What are the smallest components, and how are they arranged? That shift from appearance to structure is one of the reasons his philosophy remains so fascinating. Imagine looking at a painting. From a distance, you see a landscape, you see mountains, you see trees, you see light, you see water. But if you move close enough, you begin seeing individual brushstrokes. The painting is still there, but your understanding of how the image is constructed has changed. Democritus imagined something similar about reality itself. Our ordinary experience shows us the finished picture. Philosophy tries to understand the underlying construction, and this led to another essential part of his system: empty space. If atoms are constantly moving and combining, they need somewhere to move. So Democritus argued that reality consists of atoms and void, being an empty space, something in what allows that something to move. This was controversial. The idea of empty space was difficult for many ancient philosophers because it seemed to create a strange problem. How can something that is nothing exist? Yet without some form of void, movement becomes difficult to explain. If everything were completely filled with matter, where could anything move? Democritus therefore gave emptiness a philosophical role. The void was not an object. It was the absence that allowed objects to move. This is where his philosophy becomes surprisingly sophisticated. Change does not require matter to appear from absolute nothingness. It can happen because existing things rearrange themselves. An object breaks apart. Its particles separate. Those particles later combine with others. Something new appears. From the perspective of ordinary perception, something has been created. From the deeper perspective of Democritus, matter has simply been reorganized. This allowed him to explain change without relying on supernatural intervention. The universe could operate through natural processes. Atoms moved according to their properties and interactions. Complex things emerged from simpler components, and the astonishing diversity of the world could arise from combinations of a relatively small set of fundamental building blocks. This idea also changed the way Democritus approached the gods. Ancient Greek culture was filled with divine explanations for natural events. Thunder could be associated with Zeus. Disease could be interpreted through divine displeasure. The movement of the heavens could be understood through supernatural agency. Democritus moved in a different direction. He wanted natural phenomena to have natural explanations. If lightning occurs, investigate the physical process. If a plant grows, examine its material development. If the stars move, seek an account of their motion. Do not immediately place a supernatural intention where a natural mechanism might be sufficient. This does not mean Democritus can simply be described as a modern atheist. Ancient sources preserve different interpretations of his views about gods, and the evidence is incomplete. What is much clearer is his confidence in natural explanation. The world could be investigated without constantly appealing to divine intervention. That confidence was revolutionary, because once you begin thinking this way, curiosity changes. You stop asking only, what supernatural force caused this? You begin asking, what process produced it? What is it made of? What conditions produced it? What happens when those conditions change? Could the same principle explain other phenomena? This is the beginning of a scientific style of thinking, not modern science in the full sense. Democritus lacked experiments, instruments, and the mathematical framework available to later scientists. But he possessed something intellectually important: the willingness to imagine that invisible causes might explain visible effects, and that required him to distrust the senses in a very specific way. Our senses are useful, but they may not reveal the ultimate structure of reality. Consider color. We experience an object as red, but Democritus could ask whether redness exists in the object exactly as we experience it. Or perhaps the object has certain physical properties, while the experience of redness arises through the interaction between those properties and our sensory system. The same question applies to sweetness. to sound, to warmth, to cold. The ancient world did not yet possess modern theories of perception, but Democritus was already distinguishing between the qualities presented to consciousness and the underlying physical structure that produces those experiences. This was a major philosophical move. It suggested that the world as experienced and the world as it exists independently of our experience might not be identical. And once that possibility is opened, an entirely new field of philosophical investigation appears. What is reality itself? What belongs to the external world? What belongs to the observer? And how much of what we call reality is actually a product of the way our bodies and minds interact with the world? These questions would continue for thousands of years. But Democritus did not stop with physics. He also wanted to understand human beings. Because if human bodies are made of atoms, then perhaps human thought and emotion also have natural explanations. The mind does not need to be treated as a mysterious substance completely detached from the physical world. It can be investigated as part of nature. This was another enormous step. Fear, pleasure, pain, desire, memory, perception, all could potentially be connected to material processes. Human beings were not outside nature. We were inside it. And that realization would eventually lead Democritus toward an ethical question that might seem completely separate from atoms. If everything is physical, if everything changes, if human beings are temporary arrangements of matter, then what should a person do with their brief existence? This is where Democritus becomes much more than an ancient theorist of invisible particles. Because beneath his physics was a philosophy of how to live. And his answer was not to chase everything the senses desire. It was to cultivate a particular kind of inner balance. He believed that the good life depended upon a condition of the soul often associated with tranquility. A person who is constantly driven by limitless desire can possess everything and still remain miserable. Another person may possess very little and yet live with remarkable contentment. The difference is not necessarily the amount of external wealth. It is the condition of the mind. Democritus had spent his life asking what the universe was made of, but eventually his philosophy turned toward another question. What kind of arrangement should exist inside a human being if a person wants to live well within this enormous, changing, material universe? Democritus' answer to the question of how a person should live begins with something that seems almost contradictory to his picture of the physical universe. If everything around us is made of atoms moving through the void, if the human body itself is a temporary arrangement of matter, and if everything we possess will eventually change and disappear, then why should a human life be concerned with anything beyond immediate survival and pleasure? Democritus thought the answer was precisely because our lives are temporary. A person who understands the world properly should not spend that limited existence being consumed by endless desire. This is where his philosophy moves from physics into ethics. The good life, for Democritus, was closely connected with a calm and well-ordered condition of the soul. Ancient sources associate him with the idea of euthymia, often translated as cheerfulness, good spirits, or tranquility of the soul. The word does not describe shallow happiness or constant excitement. It points toward a deeper condition in which a person is internally balanced rather than continually pulled apart by excessive desires. This was a remarkable ethical conclusion for an atomist. If the universe does not revolve around human wishes, then perhaps happiness should not depend upon getting everything we want from it. Instead, happiness should depend upon learning what is genuinely worth wanting. That distinction is enormous. Desire itself is not necessarily the enemy. Without desire, human beings would not learn, create love, explore, or improve themselves. The problem is uncontrolled desire. A person wants money, then more money. They want recognition, then greater recognition. They want comfort, then perfect comfort. They want pleasure, then more intense pleasure. They want admiration, then universal admiration. The mind keeps moving the destination. What seems sufficient yesterday becomes insufficient tomorrow. Democritus saw this as a recipe for inner instability. A person can become wealthy and remain poor in spirit because their desires have expanded faster than their possessions. Someone can achieve great fame and become more anxious than before because now they are terrified of losing it. Someone can obtain comfort and become less capable of tolerating even minor inconvenience. The problem is not simply having things. The problem is allowing external things to determine the condition of the soul. Democritus therefore placed great importance on moderation. The wise person learns to enjoy what is available without becoming enslaved to it. This is a subtle philosophy of pleasure. He did not simply condemn pleasure. He understood that pleasure is part of human life. But pleasure becomes destructive when it turns into dependence. If a person can enjoy a meal without believing they need luxury every day, they possess a kind of freedom. If they can appreciate wealth without believing that wealth defines their worth, they possess another kind of freedom. If they can enjoy praise without requiring constant admiration, they become less vulnerable to the opinions of others. The person who needs increasingly more from the external world becomes increasingly dependent upon circumstances. The person who learns to regulate desire becomes inwardly more independent. This is why Democritus could value simplicity without romanticizing deprivation. A simple life can contain enormous richness if the mind is capable of appreciating it. A meal shared with friends, a conversation, learning something new, walking beneath an open sky, working on something carefully, living among people one respects. These experiences can produce a form of happiness that does not require endless accumulation. The crucial point is that the mind must be capable of receiving them. A person who is constantly comparing what they have with what someone else possesses may be surrounded by abundance and still feel deprived. Another person may possess little but experience genuine contentment because they are not constantly measuring their life against an imagined superior one. Democritus understood that comparison can distort desire. We do not merely want things because they are useful. We often want them because someone else has them. We want status because others recognize status. We want wealth because wealth signals success. We want beauty because other people admire it. We want possessions partly because they tell us something about where we stand in relation to other people. This creates an endless psychological competition. There is always another person ahead, another achievement, another possession, another level of recognition. If happiness depends upon winning that competition, happiness becomes extremely difficult. Democritus wanted the individual to step outside that cycle. Learn to judge value for yourself. Ask whether something genuinely contributes to a good life. Do not automatically assume that what society admires is what the soul requires. This becomes particularly important in his treatment of wealth. Ancient sources attribute to Democritus the idea that wealth is useful, but that the wise person should not become enslaved to it. There is a difference between possessing wealth and being possessed by wealth. The first is an external condition. The second is a psychological condition. A wealthy person who can lose money without losing all sense of identity may remain inwardly stable. A poorer person who spends every waking moment dreaming about possessions may be psychologically enslaved even before acquiring them. Democritus therefore located the central problem inside desire. The question is not simply, how much do I have? It is, how much do I believe I need in order to be content? That question remains uncomfortable because modern life often teaches the opposite lesson. We are surrounded by messages telling us that the next purchase, achievement, upgrade, or accomplishment will finally complete us. Democritus would likely recognize the structure immediately. Desire creates a target. The target is reached. The mind adjusts. A new target appears. The process repeats. If we never examine the mechanism, we can spend an entire lifetime moving toward a horizon that constantly moves away from us. For Democritus, wisdom meant learning where enough actually is. That did not require abandoning ambition. It required distinguishing meaningful ambition from endless appetite. A person can want to become more knowledgeable because knowledge enriches the mind. They can want to become more virtuous because character matters. They can work hard because useful work contributes to themselves and others. But wanting to possess more simply because someone else possesses more creates a different kind of life. The first desire develops the person. The second can consume them. This distinction also appears in Democritus' understanding of the soul. Because he was an atomist, he believed the soul itself was composed of extremely fine and mobile atoms. This meant that consciousness was part of the natural world rather than an entirely separate supernatural substance. The soul was material. It could be affected. It could become disturbed. It could become ordered. And because it belonged to nature, it could be studied through natural reasoning. This allowed Democritus to approach psychological life without separating it completely from the physical world. The condition of the body affects the condition of the mind. The condition of the mind affects behavior. Repeated behavior shapes character. Character influences how a person experiences the world. So the good life requires attention to the whole human being. This is one reason his ethics cannot be reduced to simple pleasure-seeking. He was interested in the quality of the soul. A person who continually indulges every appetite may experience many moments of pleasure and still live badly. A person who exercises moderation may experience fewer dramatic pleasures but possess greater stability. Democritus therefore distinguished between intense pleasure and enduring well-being. An enormous feast may create pleasure for an evening, but a disciplined and balanced life can create a condition of contentment that lasts far longer. The first is an event. The second is a character, and character was far more important. This also explains his emphasis on education. Human beings are not automatically wise. We have to learn how to think. We have to learn how to distinguish appearance from reality. We have to learn how to recognize false beliefs. We have to learn how desire manipulates judgment. We have to learn how to examine our own motives. Education, therefore, becomes more than acquiring information. It becomes the cultivation of a better mind. Democritus was famous in antiquity for his enormous range of interests, and although most of his writings are lost, ancient testimonies indicate that he wrote about mathematics, nature, astronomy, medicine, perception, ethics, music, and many other subjects. This breadth reveals something important about his conception of wisdom. Reality is interconnected. To understand one part of existence can help illuminate another. Physics tells us what the world is made of. Psychology examines how human beings experience that world. Ethics asks how we should live within it. These are not completely separate investigations. They meet in the individual. Once a person understands that their body and mind are temporary natural structures, the obsession with permanent possession begins to look less reasonable. Everything changes. So perhaps the sensible response is not to cling desperately to everything that passes through our hands. Perhaps it is to use what we have while it is here. This does not mean becoming detached from relationships. Democritus placed real importance on friendship. A good friend was not merely someone useful. Friendship could contribute directly to a good human life because human beings are social creatures, and because companionship can provide trust, affection, understanding, and shared joy. But even here, moderation matters. A friendship based entirely on advantage is fragile because once the advantage disappears, the relationship has little reason to survive. A friendship grounded in genuine goodwill is different. It creates a form of happiness that cannot be reduced to possession. You do not own a friend. You share a life with them for as long as circumstances permit. That distinction fits perfectly with Democritus' broader understanding of impermanence. We should appreciate what exists without demanding that it become eternal. The same principle applies to life itself. Human beings fear death because they imagine death as a terrible experience that they will somehow have to endure forever. Democritus challenged that way of thinking. If consciousness depends upon the particular arrangement of the soul's atoms, then when that arrangement dissolves, the conscious individual no longer exists in the same form. Death is therefore not something the living person experiences as an endless condition. There is no eternal subject sitting somewhere suffering through its own absence. This argument would become deeply influential in later materialist and Epicurean thought. The fear of death Democritus believed, often damages life long before death arrives. A person can become so afraid of losing life that they never properly live it. They constantly anticipate disaster. They refuse meaningful risks. They become obsessed with preservation. They spend their present existence worrying about an inevitable future. But death is part of nature. The atoms that temporarily constitute a human being will eventually disperse and enter other arrangements. Nothing about this makes life worthless. If anything, it makes the time we have more precious. A temporary life can still contain knowledge, friendship, beauty, laughter, discovery, love, wisdom. The fact that something ends does not mean that it should never have begun. This is perhaps the quiet center of Democritus' ethics. He looked at a universe in which everything changes and refused to conclude that nothing matters. Instead, he asked how a finite being can live intelligently inside that change. The answer was not frantic accumulation. It was cultivation. Cultivate understanding. Cultivate moderation. Cultivate friendship. Cultivate a cheerful and balanced soul. Learn to distinguish what is genuinely valuable from what merely appears valuable, because society has taught you to desire it. And above all, learn to enjoy existence without demanding that existence become permanent. The deeper we enter Democritus' philosophy, the more clearly we can see that his atomism was never merely an attempt to explain what stones, trees, bodies, and stars are made of. It was part of a much larger attempt to free the human mind from confusion. He wanted people to understand that appearances can deceive, that desire can distort judgment, and that much of the suffering we experience comes not directly from things themselves, but from the beliefs we attach to them. This is especially important in his account of perception. We normally trust our senses without thinking about them. We see a red object and simply say that the object is red. We taste something sweet and assume sweetness belongs to the thing exactly as we experience it. We hear music and imagine that the sound exists in the world in precisely the form in which it appears to consciousness. Democritus questioned this confidence. The object outside us may possess certain physical characteristics, but the experience produced inside us is something more complicated. What we call color, taste, smell, warmth, or cold may depend upon the interaction between external bodies and our sensory organs. This does not mean that our senses are useless. Quite the opposite. Without them, we could not navigate the world. But they are limited. They give us appearances. Reason must investigate what lies beneath those appearances. This distinction was one of the most intellectually ambitious aspects of his philosophy. The senses tell us what seems to be happening. Thought asks why it appears that way. Imagine standing beside a fire. You feel warmth. You see light. You see flames moving. The ordinary mind stops there. Democritus wants to continue. What is the flame? What is heat? What is happening between the fire and the body? What physical changes produce the sensation? The same curiosity can be applied to everything. Why does one substance dissolve while another does not? Why does one object float while another sinks? Why does a plant grow toward light? Why does a body become sick? Why do human beings experience different sensations? Instead of treating each phenomenon as an isolated mystery, Democritus searched for underlying mechanisms. This is where his atomism became an entire worldview. The visible world was the result of invisible processes. Objects were not fundamentally what they appeared to be. They were arrangements, structures, temporary organizations of atoms. A human body was not an indivisible thing in the deepest sense. It was a highly complex arrangement that could change from moment to moment. A mountain was not permanently fixed. Wind, water, heat, pressure, and time gradually altered its structure. A living tree was not a permanent entity. It grew, transformed, reproduced, decayed, and eventually returned its material to the larger natural world. Everything was process. Everything was arrangement. Everything was subject to change. And once Democritus saw the world this way, the human obsession with permanence began to look increasingly strange. We behave as though possessions belong to us absolutely. as though our bodies will remain exactly as they are, as though our social position is stable, as though relationships are guaranteed, as though today's circumstances have somehow been promised to us forever. But nature offers no such guarantee. The same physical principle that allows something to come together also allows it to come apart. The atoms that form one arrangement can later become part of another. The body that is strong eventually weakens. The house that appears permanent eventually deteriorates. The empire that seems invincible eventually changes. The individual who believes they have finally secured everything eventually discovers that nothing external can be secured forever. Democritus did not draw a pessimistic conclusion from this. He drew a practical one. Do not build your entire happiness upon things whose nature is to change. This is why his ethical writings repeatedly return to the condition of the soul. The soul should be brought into a state of balance. A person who is constantly agitated by ambition, envy, fear, greed, and excessive desire becomes internally unstable. And this instability can exist even when external circumstances look successful. Consider someone who has wealth, but constantly fears losing it. From the outside, they possess abundance. Internally, they live in poverty because their mind is dominated by fear. Consider someone who receives admiration, but becomes dependent upon it. They may have a high reputation, but their emotional state is controlled by other people's opinions. Consider someone who achieves a great goal and immediately becomes dissatisfied because another goal appears. They have succeeded externally, but psychologically they are always behind. Democritus' solution was not to reject achievement. It was to stop confusing achievement with the foundation of happiness. A person can pursue excellence without becoming enslaved to comparison. They can appreciate possessions without worshiping them. They can enjoy pleasure without needing constant stimulation. They can experience success without believing that success has transformed them into a fundamentally more valuable human being. This requires self-knowledge, and self-knowledge was central to the ancient philosophical tradition in which Democritus worked. The human being is often a stranger to their own motives. We tell ourselves that we want something because it is good for us, but perhaps we want it because someone else has it. We tell ourselves that we are angry because justice demands it, but perhaps our pride has been wounded. We tell ourselves that we are ambitious because we want to contribute something meaningful, but perhaps we simply cannot tolerate being ordinary. We tell ourselves that we need a certain possession, but perhaps we have been trained to believe that possessing it will make us worthy. Democritus' philosophy encourages a person to examine these motives. What is actually necessary? What is merely desired? What is genuinely valuable? What has society taught you to value? And what remains valuable when nobody is watching? These questions can radically simplify a life. Suppose you discover that you do not need universal admiration. Immediately, an enormous burden disappears. Suppose you realize that you do not need to be richer than everyone around you. Another burden disappears. Suppose you understand that the future cannot be guaranteed. You can stop demanding certainty. Suppose you accept that death is unavoidable. You can stop treating mortality as a problem that can be solved through anxiety. This is the relationship between Democritus' physics and his ethics. The physical universe teaches impermanence. Ethics teaches us how to live intelligently within impermanence. There is another important element here. Democritus placed considerable value on cheerfulness. But the cheerfulness he advocated should not be confused with permanent happiness or forced positivity. He was not telling people to smile regardless of circumstances. His idea was closer to an internal steadiness. A person who understands their limits does not constantly demand more from life. A person who knows that fortune changes does not collapse whenever circumstances shift. A person who has moderated their desires is not perpetually frustrated by the distance between reality and fantasy. Their soul becomes lighter. This is why moderation is not simply a restriction. It can actually increase freedom. If you need luxury to enjoy yourself, ordinary life becomes disappointing. If you need constant entertainment, silence becomes uncomfortable. If you need praise, criticism becomes unbearable. If you need certainty, uncertainty becomes terrifying. If you need everyone to agree with you, disagreement becomes a personal threat. But when desire becomes more disciplined, the range of circumstances in which you can live peacefully becomes much larger. A simple meal can be enough. A quiet evening can be enough. A small circle of genuine friends can be enough. A day spent learning can be enough. The absence of applause does not have to feel like rejection. Democritus was therefore interested in reducing unnecessary dependence. The fewer artificial necessities we create, the more room we have for genuine contentment. This also explains his admiration for intellectual independence. He wanted human beings to investigate rather than simply accept. Tradition can be wrong. Popular opinion can be wrong. The senses can be misleading. Authority can be mistaken. The majority can believe something without understanding it. Wisdom requires examination. This attitude is especially visible in his natural philosophy. He was willing to propose invisible atoms because he thought the evidence of reason required us to move beyond immediate perception. That takes intellectual courage. It means accepting that the first appearance of reality may not be the deepest truth. The same courage is required psychologically. You may discover that the beliefs you have about yourself are not accurate. Perhaps you are not as independent as you imagine. Perhaps your ambitions are partly inherited from other people's expectations. Perhaps your fears are based on possibilities rather than facts. Perhaps your idea of success has been constructed from comparison. Philosophy becomes uncomfortable when it starts dismantling these assumptions. But Democritus believed that intellectual honesty was worth the discomfort. He also understood the importance of education because ignorance leaves people vulnerable to fear. A person who does not understand natural phenomena may imagine supernatural explanations. A person who does not understand their own desires may become controlled by them. A person who does not understand mortality may spend their life terrified of it. Knowledge can therefore liberate. The more accurately we understand nature, the less mysterious and threatening many events become. This was one of the great hopes of ancient natural philosophy, to replace superstition with understanding. Not because knowledge eliminates every mystery. It does not. But because an unknown event is not automatically evidence of divine punishment or cosmic hostility. The universe can be investigated. Questions can be asked. Hypotheses can be proposed. Explanations can be compared. The mind can move from fear toward understanding. This is why Democritus' legacy extends far beyond the ancient world. His specific theory of atoms was not modern atomic theory. Ancient atomism lacked the experimental evidence, mathematics, and detailed physical mechanisms developed by modern science. But the philosophical instinct was extraordinary. Look beneath appearances. Search for underlying structure. Explain complexity through simpler components. Do not assume that something is impossible merely because it cannot be seen. And above all, allow reason to investigate the world rather than forcing the world to fit inherited assumptions. That intellectual attitude would reappear again and again throughout the history of science. Yet Democritus never abandoned the human question. Suppose we eventually understand matter. Suppose we understand the stars. Suppose we understand the body. Suppose we understand perception. What then? How should a human being live? His answer returns us to tranquility. The wise person should seek a condition in which the soul is not constantly thrown into disorder by excessive desire. This does not mean becoming emotionless. It means becoming less easily dominated. You can enjoy without clinging. You can suffer without becoming completely destroyed by suffering. You can possess without becoming possessed. You can succeed without becoming arrogant. You can fail without believing that your entire existence has become worthless. You can love without pretending that what you love belongs to you forever. And you can face death without allowing fear of death to consume the life that remains. This is where the ancient atomist becomes unexpectedly intimate. He began by looking outward at the universe. He asked what stars, stones, bodies, and plants were made of, but eventually the investigation turned inward. What is happening inside the person who wants too much? What creates fear? What produces contentment? Why does one person remain calm while another becomes consumed by circumstances? What does it mean to live well when everything around us is temporary? Democritus' philosophy suggests that wisdom begins when we stop demanding that reality satisfy every desire. The universe does not exist to confirm our preferences. It simply is what it is. Our task is to understand it as clearly as we can, and then learn how to live within it without creating unnecessary suffering for ourselves or others. Democritus' philosophy ultimately leads us toward a question that is much larger than the question with which he began. If the universe is composed of countless atoms moving through the void, if everything we see is temporary, if human beings themselves are brief arrangements of matter, and if even our most powerful emotions arise within the natural order of things, then what does it mean to live a good human life? His answer was not to escape the world. It was to understand it well enough that we no longer need to fight against reality at every turn. This is the quiet strength of Democritus. He did not imagine that wisdom could make a person immortal. It could not. He did not believe philosophy could prevent loss. It could not. He did not believe knowledge would remove every difficulty. It would not. What knowledge could do was change the way a person moved through the difficulties that could not be removed. And that is a much more serious promise. Democritus understood that human beings often make themselves miserable by wanting reality to be something other than what it is. We want the past to have happened differently. We want people to behave differently. We want our bodies never to age. We want our possessions never to disappear. We want our achievements to remain permanently meaningful. We want the people we love to remain beside us forever. But none of these demands can defeat the structure of nature. Everything changes. Everything that comes together can eventually come apart. Everything that is born eventually passes away. The wise response is not indifference. It is proportion. Enjoy what is present without pretending that it is permanent. Love people without imagining that love gives you ownership over time. Build something meaningful without demanding that it last forever. Learn as much as you can without assuming that knowledge will answer every question. Live fully without demanding that life guarantee another tomorrow. This attitude is closely connected with Democritus' understanding of death. For him, death was not a mysterious punishment imposed upon the individual. It was part of nature. The arrangement of matter that constitutes a human being eventually breaks apart. The atoms continue. The particular organization that we call a person does not. This view allowed him to challenge one of the most powerful sources of human anxiety, the fear of death. A person can spend years fearing an event that has not happened. They can imagine the moment. They can imagine the loss. They can imagine what will happen to their possessions, their relationships, their plans, and their identity. And in doing so, they can allow death to occupy years of a life that is still being lived. Democritus wanted to interrupt this psychological imprisonment. Death belongs to nature. It is not an accident outside the order of existence. The same natural processes that allow life to emerge also allow life to end. The individual cannot negotiate with this fact, but they can decide whether fear of it will dominate the years that precede it. This does not mean that grief is foolish or that losing someone should not hurt. Democritus was not offering a cheap solution to mortality. He was offering perspective. The fact that something is temporary does not make it worthless. A song does not become meaningless because it ends. A sunset does not become meaningless because darkness follows. A friendship does not become meaningless because one day one of the friends will die. A human life does not need to be eternal in order to contain value. Its value can exist within its limited duration. This is one of the most humane consequences of his materialism. Instead of asking how we can escape the conditions of nature, we can ask how we can live beautifully within them. And for Democritus, that required cultivating the soul. He repeatedly emphasized moderation because uncontrolled desire makes human beings vulnerable. The person who believes happiness requires endless wealth will never feel wealthy enough. The person who believes happiness requires constant pleasure will become restless whenever stimulation disappears. The person who requires universal admiration will live in fear of criticism. The person who needs complete certainty will remain anxious because the future is never completely certain. But the person who learns to distinguish necessity from excess becomes harder to disturb. This is not poverty for the sake of poverty. It is freedom from unnecessary dependence. If you can appreciate enough, you become less desperate for more. If you can live with simplicity, ordinary pleasures become more visible. If you can control desire, you no longer have to obey every appetite. And when desire becomes less demanding, the mind becomes quieter. That quietness was not emptiness. It was a form of richness. Democritus' idea of cheerfulness was not the modern command to remain positive regardless of circumstances. It was closer to an inner condition in which the soul is not constantly torn apart by contradictory desires. A person can experience sadness and still possess balance. They can experience disappointment without becoming bitter. They can encounter difficulty without immediately concluding that life itself has become meaningless. They can experience success without becoming intoxicated by it. The soul becomes steadier because it is no longer asking the external world to provide permanent security. This also explains why Democritus placed importance on friendship. A human being is not meant to live as an isolated unit. Knowledge is shared. Language is shared. Culture is shared. Work is shared. Life itself is sustained through countless relationships. A good friendship can therefore become one of the genuine sources of human happiness. But friendship also requires freedom from excessive possession. A friend is not an object. A relationship is not a guarantee against loneliness. The wise person values another human being precisely because that person is a living individual with their own freedom and impermanence. This makes friendship more precious rather than less. You do not appreciate a person less because their life is temporary. You appreciate the time you actually have with them. This principle can extend to almost everything. Democritus' philosophy encourages us to look at the ordinary world with greater attention. The meal in front of you, the person speaking to you, the opportunity to learn, the ability to walk, the ability to think, the quietness of an evening, the pleasure of friendship, the satisfaction of completing useful work. These things can seem insignificant when the mind is constantly pursuing something larger. But a life is made from these small experiences. The person who cannot appreciate the ordinary because they are always waiting for something extraordinary may eventually discover that they spent their entire life overlooking what was already there. Democritus, therefore, offers a different conception of wealth. The richest person is not necessarily the one who possesses the most. It may be the person who needs the least in order to experience contentment. This idea does not reject ambition. It changes the reason for ambition. Learn because understanding enlarges your mind. Work because meaningful work gives structure to life. Create because creation can express something valuable. Help others because human beings are connected. Pursue excellence because excellence develops your capacities. But do not make the mistake of believing that external success will finally answer every internal question. There will always be another achievement, another possession, another comparison, another person to impress, another level to reach. If you make these things the foundation of happiness, the foundation will always move. Democritus wanted something more stable, a mind capable of knowing what is enough. That idea becomes even more powerful when combined with his natural philosophy. The same person who believed reality was built from countless tiny particles understood that human beings are temporary. The body is temporary. The empire is temporary. The house is temporary. The reputation is temporary. Even the memory of a person is temporary. Everything belongs to change. So why spend your entire life attempting to possess what nature itself guarantees you cannot keep forever? Use things, enjoy things, care for things, but do not give them the power to define your existence. This is perhaps the central liberation offered by Democritus. He wanted human beings to become less frightened by appearances. The world may look chaotic, but perhaps there are deeper structures beneath what we see. Life may look unstable, but perhaps instability itself is part of the natural order. Death may look like an absolute destruction, but perhaps it is the dissolution of an arrangement that was always temporary. Failure may look like the end of everything, but perhaps it is simply one configuration changing into another. Once the mind becomes accustomed to thinking in terms of process rather than permanence, many experiences become easier to understand. Nothing remains exactly as it is. That does not mean nothing matters. It means value has to be understood within change. This is also why Democritus' intellectual legacy became so important. His specific atomism was not modern atomic physics. The atoms of modern science are not simply the indivisible particles he imagined, and the universe is far more complicated than the ancient theory could have known. But his method contained an extraordinary intuition. Do not stop with appearances. Search for structure. Ask what lies beneath what you can see. Look for simple principles that can explain complex phenomena. Prefer natural explanations when natural explanations are possible. Question assumptions. Use reason. And remain willing to revise your understanding as knowledge grows. That intellectual attitude helped create a path that later thinkers could develop in radically different directions. Democritus also reminds us that science and philosophy were once deeply intertwined. To ask what matter is made of was also to ask what existence means. To understand the body was also to ask what the mind is. To understand perception was also to ask whether our experience accurately represents reality. To understand death was also to ask how human beings should spend the limited time available to them. These questions cannot be separated as neatly as modern academic disciplines sometimes suggest. The ancient philosopher was trying to understand the whole, and perhaps that is the most valuable aspect of Democritus' work. He refused to accept that the world had to be understood only from the surface. He looked deeper. He looked beneath objects, beneath perception, beneath fear, beneath desire, beneath social status, and beneath the human assumption that our private concerns are the center of the universe. What he found was a world vastly larger than the individual, a universe of motion, matter, change, generation, dissolution, countless processes continuing whether human beings understand them or not. And within that immense universe, a human life is extraordinarily small. But small does not mean meaningless. A person can still think. A person can still learn. A person can still love. A person can still become wiser. A person can still help another person. A person can still create something beautiful. A person can still cultivate a soul capable of tranquility. That is enough. Perhaps Democritus' greatest lesson is not about atoms at all. It is about proportion. Remember how large the universe is. Remember how temporary your possessions are. Remember how easily desire can expand. Remember how little control you possess over the entire course of events. And then remember what remains within your reach. Your judgment, your habits, your learning, your relationships, your conduct, your ability to appreciate the life that is actually here. This does not make a person passive. It makes their effort more intelligent. You stop wasting energy demanding that the universe become smaller so that it can fit your expectations. Instead, you expand your understanding enough to live within the universe as it is. Democritus began by asking what everything is made of. His answer was astonishingly simple: atoms and void. But from that physical picture emerged a much larger meditation on human existence. Everything changes. Nothing external can be held forever. Perception does not reveal everything. Desire can deceive us. Fear can distort our understanding. Knowledge can liberate. Moderation can create freedom. Friendship can enrich life. And tranquility becomes possible when the mind stops demanding more from reality than reality can provide. The man who looked at the visible world and imagined invisible atoms was teaching something quietly radical. Do not confuse appearance with truth. Do not confuse possession with happiness. Do not confuse permanence with value. And do not confuse the inevitability of death with the meaninglessness of life. We are temporary. Our circumstances are temporary. The people around us are temporary. The things we build are temporary. But within that temporary existence, there is still room for understanding. There is still room for kindness. There is still room for friendship. There is still room for laughter. There is still room for wonder. And there is still time to become wiser than we were yesterday. Democritus spent his life looking beneath the surface of things. Perhaps that is where we should leave him, not merely as the ancient thinker who imagined atoms, but as a philosopher who understood that the deepest freedom begins when we learn to see reality clearly. The world does not promise permanence. It does not promise comfort. It does not promise that our desires will be fulfilled. But it gives us something else, a brief opportunity to understand, a brief opportunity to live, a brief opportunity to choose what kind of person we will be while our small arrangement of matter remains here. And perhaps, for Democritus, that was never something to fear. It was something to appreciate.